Hello everyone. My name is Zack, and it is important that you know that. It is imperative that you understand that my name is Zack in real life, and that my channel name has nothing to do with the fact that I'm going to be talking about a director called Zack. Got that? Good. With that out of the way, I remember when Justice League was released in theatres back in the far simpler times of almost 3 years ago. I remember being so fascinated about its catastrophic box office failure at the time and wanting to learn more. Fast forward about 8 months later, I'd finally got around to watching Man of Steel and Batman v Superman, and actually really enjoying them despite their flaws. And it was around mid-2018 that I started to become a fan of the Zack Snyder DC films, and indeed, Zack Snyder as a filmmaker. I started watching all of his movies and fell in love with his unique directorial style, and I would eventually publish a video detailing my newfound opinions on his DC films back in August of 2018. But in those earlier days, I was certainly aware of the newfound #ReleaseTheSnyderCut movement, a movement which I now consider myself a part of. I'm not gonna lie, I rooted for these guys ever since the beginning. This sort of crazy, but mostly really passionate group of fans convinced that there was a better, darker, alternate cut of Justice League out there, despite being humiliated and mocked by pretty much all the media outlets across the board for even daring to hope for it. I'd always been interested in the idea of a Snyder Cut even before I became a fan of the director's work, and I would eventually show my support for the movement in a video that I posted in January of 2019. I worked really hard on that video, and not to brag, but it sort of got a lot of attention. A little too much attention, as it turned out, having been sadly blocked by Warner Brothers up till this day. Things would eventually get crazier when Snyder himself revealed that he indeed had a cut of Justice League that was 214 minutes long, albeit in a somewhat incomplete form in regards to its visual effects.
I've seen the Snyder Cut, so.
So what does that mean? Because the effects aren't done.
Oh, do you think Zack couldn't finish it? You don't think he...
I don't know. Do you think we'll ever see it? Do you think the public will ever see it at this point? Because it seems like it's actually, the groundswell has grown, and a year ago I would have had my doubts.
Things started getting crazier and crazier, more and more information about this Snyder Cut began to surface, and the likelihood of it eventually seeing the light of day began to get bigger and bigger. I remember when the Release the Snyder Cut hashtag was trending on the theatrical cut's 2-year anniversary last year, and rumours began to fly that something was indeed underway.
Fucking release the Snyder Cut, am I right?
Exactly. Release the Snyder Cut.
Release the fucking Snyder Cut.
The fruits of the community's labour finally bared in May of this year, when after multiple teasers and several disheartening denials, Zack Snyder's cut of Justice League was finally announced. The cut was always real, and now with the blessing of HBO Max, it will be expanded into a mini-series with assistance from footage in Snyder's 5-hour assembly cut and some additional photography. So it's pretty clear I'm over the moon that the Snyder Cut is being released, having been aware of it for almost 3 years at this point. What we've heard about it and seen from it so far has been very promising. The trailer released at DC Fandom was absolutely beautiful, and I'll admit, it almost got me a little emotional. I'm seriously looking forward to watching it, as I've been hungering for a genuine conclusion, and possible continuation, to Snyder's story ever since I fell in love with his previous 2 efforts. But I think the main reason that I wanted the Snyder Cut to be released was because it was simply the right thing to do. In my opinion, the theatrical cut of Justice League, or Josstice League as a lot of people like to call it, is one of the biggest cinematic crimes of the last decade. A product of corporate incompetence, shameless pandering to overly nostalgic fanboys, and the screwing over of an artist and his team in the middle of a family tragedy, Justice League's theatrical cut is filmmaking with the scummiest intentions behind it. There have been many bad or mediocre films over the years that have bored or frustrated me, but I don't think I've ever seen a film that offends me as much as this. I actually considered reviewing the film back when it came out in theatres, but in hindsight, I'm honestly glad I didn't, because now that we know the gist of what all went down behind the scenes, I feel like I have much more to say about this movie now than I ever could have back then. For those who don't know, Justice League suffered a turbulent production because Warner executives were trying to make the movie more commercially palatable after the less than stellar response to Snyder's previous film, Batman v Superman, which was criticised for being too slow, dark, and introspective. In the middle of a chaotic production full of rewrites and extreme executive micromanagement, Zack Snyder's daughter, Autumn, tragically died by suicide. At the time, we were led to believe that Snyder had chosen to step down from the movie to be with his family, and had asked his buddy, Avengers director Joss Whedon, to finish the movie for him in his absence. At least, that was the official story. While we still don't know exactly what went down behind the scenes, it's become increasingly clear that this explanation was a Warner Brothers PR move, and that Snyder stepped down for far more reasons than they let on to. In his place, Whedon was asked by executives to rewrite 80 pages of screenplay, with mandates by executives ordering to make the movie funnier, more light-hearted, cut it down to a running time of under 2 hours, so that said executives could meet deadlines in order to receive their annual bonuses. This is the main reason why I hate Josstice League so much. The fact that Snyder, whether you love him or hate him, put in that effort and dedication to make a movie, and Warner Brothers effectively capitalised on his absence to hire another artist to deface his work, and yet still sell it with Snyder's name on it. It doesn't matter whether you like Snyder's films or not, that is disgraceful and should not be forgiven. Keeping in mind that Snyder's original cut was almost 4 hours long, and that his assembly cut was even longer. This means that Warner Brothers effectively binned all of that hard work, all of that money spent, all of that effort from thousands of talented artists gone, in order to hastily cobble together a clearly unfinished product that was designed to please everybody by turning it into a Marvel movie, and ultimately pleasing nobody in the long run. It's just a despicable thing to do to a human being. So yes, I've supported the Snyder Cut for a while. With my opinions on that made pretty clear, let's talk about the theatrical cut that was released in 2017. I think it's pretty clear to most people that this was the worst thing Warner Brothers could have done to the movie, even under the unique circumstances they were put in at the time. The fact that the studio actively chose to spend hundreds of millions of dollars rewriting, reshooting, re-editing, restructuring, and rescoring a film that had already wrapped principal photography and was well into post-production was a disastrous decision that only ended up putting them in an even worse position. Because in doing so, they not only were having to basically remake the entire movie in about 6 months, but they were also basically doubling the budget in doing so, meaning that when the movie ultimately failed, they ended up losing more money than they would have. Thanks to all the reshoots, Josstice League clocks in as the most expensive standalone film of all time at a whopping $300 million price tag, and on top of that, it only opened to $93 million in its opening weekend. If Warner had simply stuck with Snyder's compromised cut to begin with, they wouldn't have been dealt as huge a financial blow as they ultimately were. And this is only the beginning of the incompetence that screwed over the movie. This is the Josstice League we're talking about. This is DC's Avengers, their most beloved characters, their most iconic heroes all on screen together for the first time in cinematic history. This should have been a triumph, a world-class production of a film, and yet the final product is so haphazardly put together and so obviously rushed that you can't help but wonder if what you're watching is genuinely a movie, because it sure as hell doesn't look or feel like a movie sometimes. It switches between feeling like a cheap TV movie with a low budget to feeling like some weird parody you would see on YouTube. There are a few genuinely good scenes in it, but for me, they're few and far between, and quite a lot of them are unfortunately peppered with obvious reshoots that were inserted into such scenes patchwork quilt style, and unfunny jokes and quips that feel utterly inappropriate and tone-deaf in the situations presented on screen. The fact that the Warner's regime of the time was okay with this, the fact that they stood behind this thing, this failed experiment, this grotesque, deformed, freakish Frankenstein's monster hybrid of a movie, astounds me. This is it, ladies and gentlemen. This is the first live-action Josstice League movie, and it has a man's moustache being erased by CGI. What a triumph for DC. Well done, guys. So Josstice League, as the nickname suggests, isn't just the product of a panicked studio. Several culprits stand out among the rest, the first of which being the man who took over from Snyder when he left the project, Joss Whedon. And in all fairness, I will give him some benefit of the doubt, as he was merely a puppet director dancing to the tune of the executives. Reports have actually detailed that he wanted to push back the movie to give himself more time to finish it off. Warner Brothers refused, and Whedon simply did what he could in the 6 months he was given. So not all the blame can really be laid on him, however, that's the best I can say about him, given the very unpleasant rumours we've been hearing about him over the years. Accusations of sexism, abuse, trashing of Snyder's vision despite being supposedly entrusted to finish it off, and even throwing the movie under the bus before its release on Twitter. All of this paints the guy in a very unflattering light. I don't care if he directed the Avengers, I'm glad he's being ostracised from fandom, as he's been getting away with his questionable behaviour for far too long. But one of the things that sets the tone for just how unambitious and insultingly pandering Josstice League is would have to be Whedon's decision to hire Danny Elfman to compose the score for the film. I have huge respect for Elfman and his past work, which has been the backdrop to many films I watched when I was younger. However, I have numerous problems with this score of his. I really cannot stand how desperately it tries to appease fanboys by playing on nostalgia, as it completely abandons the themes and motifs from the previous Hans Zimmer and Junkie XL scores, and instead chooses to bring back the cues from the classic era of Reeves and Keaton, regardless of the fact that they're totally incompatible with this newer take on the characters. When people think of Henry Cavill's Superman, we hear this. Not this. And the fact that Elfman seems to think that these nonsensical attempts to destroy musical continuity is some kind of grand achievement on his part really bugs me. Listen to what he has to say about it.
The whole concept that every time a superhero franchise is rebooted with a new director, then you have to start the music from scratch, is a bullshit idea. It's only for the ego of the director or the composer. They need to learn the incredible lesson that Star Wars and James Bond have known for ages. Which is that keeping these musical connections alive is incredibly satisfying for the people who see those films.
So, by your logic, why the hell didn't you use the 1966 Batman theme way back in '89? Was that not the original theme? Isn't it funny that your logic ignores the fact that there were multiple interpretations of Batman long before you and Burton had your turn, just so you can make a statement of sheer arrogance like this?
Batman has only had one theme, your theme, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, but I don't think these guys are the ones with the ego problem here, man. And I just want to be clear, I've loved this guy's music before, just not this. I hate how trite and predictable his music is here, basically telling you how to feel in the triumphant moments, and then just being a desolate landscape of strings and brass in the scenes where nothing important is happening. In comparison to the previous two scores, which could be really powerful and bombastic, and then could switch to being really ethereal and touching, this is just white noise in comparison. And this is merely the music I'm talking about here. I'm only just getting started on ripping into this monumental embarrassment of a movie. This movie was made the way it was pretty much for the sole purpose of course-correcting the DCEU, which was already fledgling at the time. But I would have much rather Warner Brothers had simply stayed their course, and that goes with Suicide Squad as well, which pretty much received the same treatment as Justice League in regards to studio meddling. In many ways, I would have rather seen Warner Brothers stick to their guns and simply go down in a blaze of glory by sticking with the vision they'd signed off on to the bitter end, the captain going down with the ship, so to speak. Instead, this film is a sign of cowardice and corporate desperation, grovelling at the feet of its most vocal critics and trying to convince everyone that it's more like its competitor. Literally everything that fans didn't like about the previous two Snyder films has pretty much been eliminated here, and the sense of balls that the DCEU had pretty much vanished along with it. The film is exactly what you'd expect from a modern-day superhero movie trying to please as many people as possible. There are literally no risks taken. The previous two films are barely referenced, making this film seem even more like a recoil, like basically shutting the door after the horses bolted. Say what you will about the creative liberties Zack Snyder took with Superman and Batman, or whether you think he gets the characters or not, if there even is such a thing, but at least he had ideas for both of them. Superman was basically an allegory for the post-9/11 Muslim experience. He arrives on Earth essentially as an illegal cosmic immigrant with big differences in abilities that humanity feels intimidated by. Then another group of his own kind initiate an apocalyptic event that kills thousands, creating an irrational xenophobia and hatred of him that closely resembles what was seen towards Muslims following the 9/11 terror attacks. Kal-El's journey throughout Man of Steel and Dawn of Justice is the ultimate story of immigration in a paranoid world. But that's still not enough to make him totally relatable. Even though he saves the world, Superman is still somewhat culpable because even he makes mistakes in doing so. He's still learning, just like the people of Earth are still learning to live with him, just like Jor-El says in his monologue.
You will give the people of Earth an ideal to strive towards. They will race behind you. They will stumble. They will fall. But in time, they will join you in the sun, Cal. In time, you will help them accomplish wonders.
Screw that though, now we're going to act as though Superman was always viewed as a bright beacon of hope for humanity, which not only makes the continuity of the films completely inconsistent, but it also robs his resurrection of any meaning, because Clark wakes up basically as the same person Whedon claims he was before. There's no character growth. I know a lot of people don't like the Jesus parallels in Snyder's Superman, but I always saw Clark's sacrifice at the end of BVS as being the moment he puts aside all his angst and doubt, and finally accepts his place on Earth and his duty to the human race. Despite much of them hating him, he gives his life to save them like a true hero would. Him being resurrected is simply the culmination of him becoming that hero that the world needs. Unfortunately, because Josstice League tries to act as though the previous two films weren't canon, Superman simply comes off as some ghostly figure who used to exist, with little effect on the character's well-beings. I mean, we don't even see how Lois is coping with his loss. And then he pretty much saves the rest of the League's ass when they can't defeat Steppenwolf. Seriously, it's basically a meme how easily Clark saves the day at the end of the film. The tagline of the movie was, back in 2017, "You can't save the world alone," when Superman literally pulls the mother boxes apart for Cyborg, rescues more civilians than Flash could ever hope to, and subdues Steppenwolf without even breaking a sweat. And then there's Batman, who suffers possibly the worst character injustice within the movie. Pun very, very intended. Whether you think it was appropriate for the character or not, Bruce Wayne in BVS was the epitome of the xenophobic American public following the 9/11 terror attacks. After facing trial after trial in his life, which has already taken a toll on him emotionally, the Black Zero event finally pushes him over the edge. Not only has he lost more that is dear to him, but here's a being that can literally level an entire city and its population with its eyes if it wants to. It doesn't matter to him that this alien might be well-intentioned. The very fact that he has the power to wipe out humanity like the others tried to do means he is automatically a likely threat. Bruce isn't taking any chances, he's just lost too much to do that.
He has the power to wipe out the entire human race, and if we believe there's even a 1% chance that he is our enemy, we have to take it as an absolute certainty.
He's paranoid, he's lost his way, and the film doesn't try to convince you otherwise. You're supposed to question his actions. You're supposed to disagree with his reckless murdering of those thugs and his sadistic beating up of Clark. So with Justice League, you would expect Batman to be a guilt-ridden figure of sorts, who blames himself for all of the bad things he's done in the past, and is trying to feel as though he can redeem himself by creating the League to fight for good in honour of Superman. But Whedon pretty much glosses over this guilt, only briefly mentioning it in a line or two.
Why? Because of your guilt?
And pretty much just turning Batman into a comedian and Bruce Wayne into a punching bag for the rest of the League. Instead of being the inspirational figure driven by Superman's sacrifice to do better, Bruce is sort of this blank slate who awkwardly crushes over Diana and then gets picked on when he actually does have some good ideas that could help out. Then he smiles like a little kid in the Batsuit, stupidly says Alfred's name out loud in front of a criminal, possibly blowing his cover in the process, failing to arrest said criminal, and embarrassing himself by cracking jokes that seriously don't land sometimes.
Oh, something is definitely bleeding.
I always thought Batman was supposed to be a determined but somewhat haunted figure in the shadows, not a goofy, gummy bear-looking buffoon. Whether you think Snyder executed his ideas well or not, you can't claim that he didn't try to give them arcs and change them throughout the films. At least it was more than what we got here, and it was done with a little bit more attention to detail. And then there's the rest of the League, and this is where I can see the Snyder Cut being far better than this monstrosity that we got in theatres. Because unlike the HBO Max version, which will be able to flesh out these characters with 4 one-hour-long episodes, Whedon had to introduce the Flash, Cyborg, and Aquaman, characters we'd never met before, within one movie that was under 2 hours in length. That is an insanely impossible task, especially when considering you have the Trinity on top of that. And the results are just as mixed as you would expect. The strongest character of the bunch is Cyborg, and I feel that's largely because Snyder always intended him to be the heart of the movie, and Whedon probably had to stick with that template that had already been set. It certainly helps that Ray Fisher delivers a really neat performance as Victor Stone, bringing a sort of human elegance that breathes life into the machine, especially during his first scenes. His character's predicament is also very understandable, but nothing is done with it at all. He just kind of says he's unhappy with his situation and hates his father, setting up an admittedly interesting tension that could be further explored, but then he immediately changes his mind when his father is kidnapped, and suddenly he's found his purpose in life. There's a few scenes of him struggling to control his powers when the plot calls for it, but it's dropped very quickly. It also doesn't help that Cyborg was essentially supposed to be the main character of the movie, and yet all his backstory and interesting development is left on the cutting room floor with nothing but a few lines of exposition to fill in the gaps. Whatever happened to that golden cinematic rule of show don't tell? And maybe I'm just seeing things here, but don't you think it's interesting that all of the actors of colour were pretty much axed from the final cut? You cast the legendary Joe Morton and Karen Bryson as Victor's parents, and yet you eliminate Morton's character sacrifice to make the film more stomachable for families, and completely erase Bryson entirely with the exception of featuring her in a few family photos. And what about Zeng Kai, who was cast as another character, soon to be revealed as the superhero known as Atom? I understand that these guys sorta needed to go for the sake of getting the movie under the 2-hour runtime mandate, but couldn't you at least give them a little cameo at best, teasing them for future sequels? But I guess Jeff Johns wouldn't want to do that so he could ultimately cast his own newer interpretations and gloat about it to the original actors. Ezra Miller's Flash is easily the most irksome character of the entire movie. It's really unfortunate because I can see what they were originally trying to do with him. In some of those earlier scenes, it becomes clear that Miller's Barry Allen has some kind of Asperger's-like tendencies that make him socially awkward and somewhat clumsy, yet keeping him overly intelligent and smart for his age. However, the makers of this cut simply took the easy way out, scraping away anything that could give him psychological depth and struggles to overcome, and simply exploit his awkward tendencies for comedy. Wow, what a great way to represent people with social disabilities. And the jokes aren't even really funny. It basically just boils down to Ezra Miller running wild on set, delivering these groaners of lines with this obnoxious childlike expression on his face. It's like Miller realised just how bad these jokes were and was trying to take the piss by playing it to a T. And as if to add insult to injury, they take away any sort of heroism the Flash could deliver to help the League, like, oh I don't know, turning back the time to give his fellow heroes a second chance when they fail. It just pisses me off to no end that people thought that stupid shit like this would make us root for these characters. I know that the studio wanted a bit more levity in Justice League, but seriously, come on, this isn't funny at all. It's just juvenile. It's what a 5-year-old would find funny.
Like brunch. Like, what is brunch? You wait in line for an hour for essentially lunch.
You deleted the Flash's key heroic moment of the movie and instead made him into a one-note comic relief Jar Jar Binks of a character. Round of applause for these guys. You don't deserve it. Aquaman is sort of just a blank slate for me, so I don't really have much to say about him. He just doesn't do all that much and doesn't say all that much of importance. Which is a shame because Jason Momoa is a freaking legend. His performance is pretty bloody great as Arthur Curry, and I love the fact that rather than being this Californian beach boy surfer dude, Aquaman's this windswept, gruff wanderer with clear Pacifica descent, oceanic tattoos and all. It really helps sell that sense of mythology that Snyder was clearly going for. It's just a shame that he has nothing to do here, besides briefly exchange a pointless conversation with Mira that ends with a big unexplained question mark.
Then I'm gonna need something from you.
We never find out what he's referring to here. And then there's that really bizarre scene where he's eyeing up Diana and commenting on her looks in front of the rest of the League. It's a really odd choice for the character that comes right out of left field, and the way it's delivered just feels really derogative. Grace Randolph pretty much nailed the way it feels in her video about the subject, and apparently Warner Brothers executives wanted more of this crap in the Aquaman movie, but James Wan knew better, thank God. Come to think of it, maybe what Aquaman was asking Mira for in that unexplained line should be left unexplained. When it comes to Wonder Woman and the female characters of this movie, all I can say is that they deserved so much better. There was a video by Grace Randolph that pretty much highlights the whole situation, and I'd recommend you all check it out. But for what it's worth, I think people should have known that bringing Whedon onto a project with Wonder Woman in it was probably a bad idea from the beginning, especially after a script from the proposed Wonder Woman movie leaked online sometime back in 2015. For those who don't know, his script was, at least from what I've seen online, very demeaning of Diana's character and pretty much placed her in the forefront of the objectifying filmmaking technique known as the male gaze. And surprise, surprise, his treatment of the character in Justice League's theatrical cut is anything but gentlemanly. From the moment Patty Jenkins herself liked a tweet announcing Whedon's departure from DC on Twitter, we should have known something fishy had been going on. I'd already mentioned that bizarre scene with Aquaman, but that's nothing compared to the rumours we've been hearing about from behind the scenes. Apparently that really unnecessary gag where Barry lands face first into Diana's cleavage was added in by Joss Whedon, which, interestingly enough, he already did between Bruce and Natasha in Avengers Age of Ultron. According to Grace Randolph, Gal Gadot didn't want to film the scene and eventually refused to be a part of it. Good for her. So what did Whedon do? He used a body double to film the joke instead. Making matters worse, there have been rumours going around from people who worked on the film that Whedon actually threatened one of the women's careers if they didn't do the scene. It's also been shown that he was the one who pushed for that romance, if that's what you can call it, between Diana and Bruce Wayne, which I'm not really a fan of. Teammates, yes. Lovers, no thanks. And then there's that bizarre shot where her ass is in full view of the camera. And yes, what you're seeing on screen here is in the movie, guys. In all fairness, this may actually be a Snyder shot, for as we now know, the infamous and highly publicised sexualisation of the Amazonian costumes were in fact done under Snyder's watch. But to be fair, many of the actresses who played the Amazons actually defended those costume choices, saying that they felt empowered while wearing them and never saw them as skimpy. You know what? You can say whatever you want about the execution of Zack Snyder's attempts at female empowerment, such as in Sucker Punch, but you can't argue that he's made some pretty decent strides with his DCEU films. And not only does he have a very supportive partner who's a feminist, and not only does he have a fair amount of feminist fans and supporters, but the women who he hires in his movies have never spoken out against him in a negative manner. In comparison, Joss Whedon's wife wrote a memoir about how he cheated on her multiple times, and literally no one from the set of Justice League, or really any of his other movies, is defending him. Well, really except from the obvious culprits. Because let's not forget all the other women in the theatrical cut who also got drawn the short straw for them. Lois and Martha get what? Really one scene together in which, instead of discussing how the death of Clark has affected them emotionally and trying to help each other through this difficult time, they have to deal with a clingy male colleague of Lois's and exchange a sex joke. Lois's only role in the movie is to bring Clark back, lament that she wasn't strong enough when he died, and act the grief-stricken love interest that she's ultimately negated to. Remember when Lois actually had agency and stood up for herself in the previous films? Come to think of it, Amy Adams never showed up to the Josstice League premiere. I wonder why. And I know this is a really small nitpick here, but I absolutely hate that news flash where the wife of the kidnapped janitor is ranting on TV, for several reasons. For one, why would the news anchor be joking about it with this smug look on his face? It's pretty serious, man. Her husband's gone missing. Are you trying to get yourself fired on live television? And if you're thinking he's joking about the whole alien part of it, remember that this isn't a post-Black Zero world where Kryptonians exist. Aliens kidnapping people shouldn't seem ridiculous to him anymore. Also, how does this woman know for sure that aliens specifically took her husband away? Is it just lazy writing to force a joke in, or is Whedon trying to make her look hysterical? A woman's weakness. Both seem pretty plausible. And most crucially, I really don't like the way the woman being interviewed refers to her husband as being a quote-unquote provider. Maybe I'm just looking too deep into this given Whedon's behaviour, but I read into that the wife of the janitor has no job and that she relies on her husband to pay the bills for her and pay for the house that ultimately shelters her. Just some food for thought. Of course, the most infamous part of Josstice League is the moustache. I remember when the movie first came out and this was all over the internet. Leaked pictures, memes, jokes, relentless mocking, it's basically become the hallmark, the trademark, the pure, iconic stamp of Warner Brothers and Joss Whedon's Justice League. You see, after he'd filmed all the scenes for Snyder during principal photography, Henry Cavill was called back for reshoots under the reign of Whedon. The problem was, Cavill had already been in the midst of filming Mission Impossible Fallout, in which he'd grown a full-blown mug of facial hair. So the studio was faced with a dilemma. They didn't want the moustache in because that would be too gritty and grizzled for their brighter, fluffier vision. So they asked Paramount Pictures if Cavill could shave his facial hair and Warner would pay them the fee to digitally add it back in post. I'm not kidding. Paramount understandably refused, so Whedon was forced to film his Superman scenes with motion tracking data plastered all over the poor actor's face so they could, wait for it, digitally remove his facial hair with CGI. And the results were not only as disastrous and grotesque as you would expect, but they unintentionally revealed just how much of Superman's scenes had been reshot by Whedon, which was, by all accounts, pretty much the whole shebang. Pretty much all of Cavill's scenes feature the pixelated rubbery upper lip, with the exception of one major scene and a few short moments. I find it funny that people kept claiming so much of the theatrical cut was still Snyder's, when the evidence of it being obviously not were literally right in front of their eyes. Henry Cavill wasn't even allowed to reveal how many scenes featured the CGI hair removal in his press interviews for the film. Gee, I wonder why. However, it's not just the moustache that's an eyesore. On basically all fronts, Justice League is pretty visually awful to look at. The Marvel films have often been criticised for their flat colour grading, bland cinematography, and occasionally wonky CGI, and rightfully so, but the theatrical cut of Justice League takes the subject of ugly superhero movies to another level altogether. Again, whether you like his style or not, Zack Snyder has a very unique and distinctive way of shooting his movies. His films, often shot on actual celluloid, emphasise heavy grain and usage of extreme contrast, giving his cinematography a noirish aesthetic that's often stylised with extremely bold colour palettes. Even the way he composes his shots gives off the impression that he's bringing comic book artwork to life, giving off this huge, expansive, ultra-cinematic vibe. With all of those conventions in mind, the theatrical cut does not look or feel like a Zack Snyder movie at all. Most of the refilmed dialogue scenes are shot in this very flat style, either against a bland set or an obvious green screen, similar to the later two Star Wars prequels. And even when we do have some original moments of dialogue in there, Whedon's reshoots are painfully inconsistent with the original photography that Snyder completed. There are plenty of videos online detailing all of the mistakes, from lighting to hairstyles to even the tattoos on Jason Momoa. It's embarrassing that the suits thought this was good enough to put on screen with people not noticing. The boosted brightness and saturation of the original Snyder footage ultimately leads to a bizarre clash of vision, where the sets and costumes that he had approved and planned to be lit under his stylised aesthetic was overexposed in post to make the film a supposedly more colourful experience for audiences, and the mise-en-scene really suffers for it. The actors are basically parading around in what looks like Halloween costumes in these flat, grey environments that look more suited to a video game cutscene, and the final battle looks like a fucking fever dream nightmare with its candy-coloured orange sky and sickening artificial recolouring. Why would you choose orange? Why? Orange is such an ugly colour. Look at the original footage. I mean, what's there to say? Look at how much nicer it looks. And let's not forget Steppenwolf and his army of parademons, the villains of the film. From what I understand, Zack Snyder was originally trying to go with a sort of Lord of the Rings vibe when it came to Justice League. Darkseid was essentially the Sauron, not the Thanos, the Sauron of the DC universe. I mean, you can even see the visual parallels between the battle scenes, and Steppenwolf was merely a ruthless servant doing his master's bidding, the Witch King of Angmar, in a sense. The parademons are basically just flying orcs. Thanks to Jeff Johns, though, Darkseid's cinematic debut pretty much got the axe, bar a useless throwaway line that's never elaborated upon.
For the unity! For Darkseid.
And thanks to the executives, the actual villains they did keep ended up being completely nuded. We already know that certain scenes were cut for being too horrific for mainstream audiences, but taking it a notch further, Warner essentially did an Age of Ultron and completely removed any sense of threat the villains might have provided. The parademons were damn intimidating in that nightmare scene in Batman v Superman. These big burly monsters with a tangibility and an actual threatening presence. Now they've been glossed up and given this annoying screech, making them feel more like CGI insects rather than actual zombie soldiers that used to be humans. They're disposed of easily, they can apparently detect fear except when they conveniently can't, and then they throw tantrums when they hear a siren. And yes, those were both confirmed to be Whedon additions. And Steppenwolf is hands down one of the worst parts of the movie by a long shot. Putting aside the fact that the compromised design looks like a plastic action figure you'd find in a kid's toy shop, he strolls into the movie with all of these cliched catchphrases and stupid evil monologues as if he's some grand apocalyptic threat we should be afraid of. But he's basically this one-note CGI video game character who sounds cool, looks stupid, likes taking over planets because it's his hobby, I guess, and delivers convenient video game exposition to fill in the scenes that were cut for the mandated runtime. From what Snyder has revealed recently, his version of Steppenwolf looks fucking awesome and terrifying in contrast, barely speaks, except only when he has to, and is probably going to be way more violent and unadulterated, and is going to meet his end in a brutal execution at the hands of the League. This bumbling oaf is nothing when weighed up against all of that. He isn't menacing at all, certainly not helped by the fact that he keeps on babbling about his mother constantly, goes around collecting these boxes that he conveniently knows the locations of, and gets taken down by his own soldiers in one of the most hilariously underwhelming deaths I have ever seen. Speaking of the mother boxes, apparently Snyder was going to take the Tolkien parallels even further, giving the boxes an actual presence similar to that of the One Ring in Lord of the Rings. At multiple times they would apparently try to entice Victor over to their side, so that the League would fail to stop the coming of Darkseid, tempting Cyborg with the false prospect that he could see his parents alive again. This would again up the threat by making the Mother Boxes an actual character that can manipulate and deceive, rather than simply having them being the world-destroying MacGuffins that the villains need. But putting all that aside, disregarding all the financial incompetence, rushed filmmaking, poor writing, and tick-box course correction, it's kinda impossible for me to separate Justice League from the men who made it. And I'm not just talking about Joss Whedon here, I'm talking about Geoff Johns, John Berg, Toby Emmerich, and Kevin Tsujihara, among others. These people elevate the theatrical cut from being an embarrassing atrocity of a movie to a genuinely indefensible piece of work. I mean, the fact that these guys allegedly threw out 75% of Snyder's work and replaced it with poorly slapped together schlock is bad enough. But seriously, just do your research and dig into the history of these men. The reports, the rumours from reasonably reliable sources, the little signs from the very beginning that something was rotten at Warner. At the head of this group of clowns is Geoff Johns, who, if rumour is to be believed, is widely hated at Warner Brothers for what went down during the production of not only Justice League, but other films as well. Johns would apparently go up to Zack Snyder's crew on the set of Wonder Woman 84, joke about releasing the Snyder Cut sarcastically, laugh obnoxiously, and then walk away. This is the same guy who preaches about hope and optimism, and yet he orchestrated the defiling of a filmmaker's art while he was in the midst of fucking mourning the loss of his daughter. This is the same guy who created plot holes in David Ayer's Suicide Squad, tried to get Patty Jenkins to cut the iconic, character-defining scene in Wonder Woman, and would reportedly mock and belittle cast members in private. And as the rumour goes, everyone at Warner Brothers despises the man. He was barred from visiting the filming of Birds of Prey and has apparently been out of his depth in DC films for a while.
And all of these people came to me and they said, he is a nightmare, and he is responsible for derailing our careers. So someone from the creative area has come to me. Someone from the executive branch has come to me. Someone in publicity has come to me. And someone from DC Comics has come to me. But one person told me that Geoff Johns had no idea what he was doing with Stargirl, and it's a miracle the show turned out so great because he was really holding it back and was just way in over his head and wouldn't admit it. And then I heard from another person that most of the people on that show hate him. They just can't stand working with him. One of these people even described Geoff Johns to me as a functioning sociopath.
I don't care how acclaimed his comics are, because if all this is true, then he is a false prophet and a hypocrite preaching ideals that he has no right to preach. Warner Brothers, please investigate this man honestly, and if he is found guilty, don't ever let him near your backlot again. John Berg was apparently an instigator and actually allowed a lot of this behaviour to occur. So that makes him guilty and liable as far as I'm concerned, and he should be held accountable if Ray Fisher's accusations are indeed true. Toby Emmerich was one of the executives who refused to push back the release date for Josstice League so that he and his fellow executives could receive their annual bonuses, and then there's Kevin Tsujihara, former CEO of Warner Brothers. Note how I say former CEO. Well, putting aside the fact that he and his fellow cronies announced this entire failed DCEU slate in the first place, and against Zack Snyder's will decided to rush the Justice League team up before committing to solo films first, the guy was actually ousted from the head of the studio because he was caught up in the hashtag #MeToo movement. This guy was actually involved in those sleazy couch casting affairs, where he and several men would give female actresses auditions and big roles in films in exchange for cheap sex. It's as gross as you can get. The guy resigned sometime in early 2019 as a result of these allegations, and it's safe to say he's nowhere near Warner Brothers anymore. And then you take into account the scummy behaviour of Joss Whedon that I previously mentioned, and the gang's all here. There you go. The men who made Justice League. In comparison, let's look at Zack Snyder. The biggest crime this guy has committed is making controversial films that mainstream audiences reject upon first viewing. Sure, the guy's not the greatest at executing his ideas, and sometimes he really does fail to get the messages he's trying to convey across. But that aside, he's never done anything unprofessional to garner any complaints from cast and crew. Literally listen to any interviews about him, from the many actors he's hired, from his creative departments, from the musicians he's worked with, even from some of the studio heads themselves. There has literally been nothing but glowing praise for the guy, personally and professionally. He's never done a Josh Trank and thrown Warner Brothers under the bus. He's never publicly spoken out against Jeff Johns or Joss Whedon. The most he's done is like a few tweets and throw some subtle jabs here and there. And for nearly 5 years in a row, how many times has the man publicly defended himself against his critics? A grand total of 3 times. 3. That's impressive. This is in a world where supposed professionals fire off tweets calling people man-babies and dismissing all criticism of their films as being unfair.
Was there any of the criticism that you read that you may feel is now kind of fair?
No.
So yeah, pick your side in this fight, but I definitely know whose I'm on. And with that, this is probably my final word on Josstice League. While I can't say for sure that it's the worst movie I've ever seen personally, it's definitely the most stomach-turning and offensive for me, and it will probably remain my most hated film for a very, very long time. It's ironic that this is a movie about a team called the Josstice League, because the theatrical cut is one of the biggest injustices I've ever seen in regards to cinema. It was an injustice to its original director and his family, who had their art effectively vandalised in the middle of a hard time for them personally. An injustice to the cast, many of whom had great amounts of their work erased to the point where some of them weren't in the movie at all. An injustice to the crew, who had to bear the ridicule of an unfinished and cheap-looking movie on their resumes. On that basis, I believe the Snyder Cut needed to be released, and I think at some point in the future it will be considered the true version of Josstice League. Because when taking everything I've just said into account, all the wasted potential, all the wasted money, all the incompetence, lies, cover-ups, and immoral intentions behind this botched cut of the movie, I genuinely can't see how Snyder's version can be any worse. Like, on an objective level. You may dislike the story or tone of the Snyder Cut, but at least it'll have an identity and a consistent vision behind it. It'll actually have a soul. It'll look better. It'll actually have time to flesh out its characters. And the fact that Zack Snyder is doing it without getting paid proves that it's more than just a cash grab. It's a passion project for him and his team, giving it far more artistic merit than Whedon's version, which was rushed purely so that executives could receive extra paychecks. That said, I don't think I'll be destroying my copy of this movie anytime soon, because I think it should stick around, and not just to be laughed at. This thing should be kept as a relic of corporate meddling gone horribly wrong, and a warning for future executives, producers, and filmmakers alike. I hate Josstice League 2017 with a burning passion, and I profusely thank HBO Max, Warner Media, AT&T, and the new regime at Warner Brothers for finally releasing and polishing the real version out there for release. Here's to 2021 and Zack Snyder's Josstice League.